Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watch One, and thanks for logging on. Today we are looking at the Rolex Oyster Perpetual GMT-Master reference 1675/3. This is a stainless steel and yellow gold 40mm two-tone. Serial number is roughly in the 5,200,000 range, so you're looking at a vintage 1675 from late 1977, early 1978. Now, the 1675 had a really long run. 1959 to 1980, so you're pretty much spanning the rock around the clock era to Van Halen in its prime. A lot of running changes came into play during the course of this model's manufacture, and I'm happy to say that this model has a lot of the most desirable examples of those running changes, so I'm going to give you an overview of what those are, how they add value to this 1675/3 two-tone, and I'm going to give you an impression of it on the wrist. So, on the wrist, the nice thing about any vintage Rolex is that it feels almost like a dress watch in comparison to the modern examples. Since 2005, with the emergence of the 6-digit reference super cases, they've had more bulk to them. They've had more mass to them. There are those who could have worn the previous 40mm variants who cannot wear these super cases, and that's where a vintage Rolex like this GMT 16753 really comes into its own. It's light on the wrist. You can see on my wrist, which is 6 1/3 inches, 16 centimeters in circumference, it sits flat and it doesn't even come close to overlapping the edges of my wrist. Those lugs aren't pushing the limit whatsoever. It's also nice and thin, and with plenty of tumble home from the top of the acrylic crystal to the edge of the sloping bi-directional GMT bezel, it can easily fit under just about any dress cuff or long sleeve, and with the combination of black accents, yellow gold, and a nice contrast of brushed and polished steel elements, it's a very versatile watch that has the look and the feel and the attitude of a Rolex professional or tool watch, but with the elegance and the refinement and a little bit of the dashing above the fray romance of the pilot's trade itself, because the GMT Master is, after all, a pilot's watch. And that's not quite the down and dirty business that you would associate with Rolex Explorers or Submariners or Sea Dwellers. This one's got a little bit more of a ravishing flair and a romance to it. And you get that. This watch is a versatile reference that is a tool watch, but has that second gear for when you need to dress it up, black tie style. Now, I want to emphasize that the nice thing about this example on the NATO strap is that sizing is very easy. It's also a very comfortable watch to wear for the summer. Bracelets can get a little bit sweaty in the summer, I'm not going to lie to you, and in very hot weather they can also conduct heat into the wrist, so it's nice to have the option of putting it on this strap, and sizing is a piece of cake. If you've ever got a new watch in the mail and worried about whether or not it would fit, taking links out, adding links back, there's not a trip to the jeweler. When you get this, you strap it on, you start having fun, and that's the nice thing about it. But it's got another element to it that I really want to call out. I talked about the running changes through the course of the 1675's history, and one of the best was the early 70s emergence of the all-black monotone bezel. Now, originally the 24-hour calibrated bezel would feature a sort of AM-PM bifurcation where you had blue and you had red, and one was night and one was day, and that was a useful reference for the pilots. But for those who wanted the watch for ground-bound affairs, the monotone black, especially with this black nipple dial, is just awesome. It visually extends this watch. So while I like to say that you could probably wear this watch on a wrist as small as 5.5 inches in circumference, there really is no upper bound to how large a wrist can accommodate this watch, because the visual extension of the dial created by that all black bezel with the thin knurled yellow gold surround, it creates a watch that reads as though its dial were as large as that of a 42 or 43mm sports reference. From a distance, you read this as one continuous black expanse with just this subtle highlight of yellow gold bounding it on the outside. You don't see the division between the dial itself, the case wall, and the bezel. It reads as a whole, and that's very much in its favor. If you have a larger wrist, this watch has as large a presence as you will ever need. And yellow gold is powerful. That's the thing about it. A sports watch in all yellow gold might be a little bit overbearing, a little bit overwhelming, and this watch has superb balance. First of all, there's that dominant black aesthetic, continued by the textile strap, and then you have the applied 1, 2, 3, 4 hands on the dial. This is the nipple dial with applied elements, and it has tritium on each of them that is patinaed so that it's almost completely in sync with the tone of the yellow gold as well as the yellow gold hands. This one has the brushed metallic style yellow gold date disc. The yellow gold colored date disc is often swapped out for a silver or white unit from other GMTs or Submariners when these watches are serviced. So this watch, being a true survivor, has both the correct date disc and it's a gorgeous complementary tone that really matches the gold and the gold printing of the dial. Unlike other contemporary 1675s, this one has an applied yellow gold 5-point Rolex coronet, not printed, matches the gilt printing, but it is an applied coronet, just like these are applied hour indices. Now the yellow gold continues on the bezel and also the twin lock crown, so you get just enough of that rich accenting without being overbearing. And then there's the brushed tops of the lugs and the polished flanks of the case itself. So you've got three tones really. You've got the silver, the black, the yellow, and you've got a sort of tritone look that's powerful and very masculine. This is an impressive watch that really punches above its weight. 40 millimeters may sound like the lower bounds of sports watch dimensions by modern standards, but let me tell you, this thing has the visual punch to go toe-to-toe with any offshore and any Hublot Big Bang, and it has class to outdo either. Now, I mentioned as long as this watch ran, there were a lot of changes aesthetically. During the mid-60s, the watch went to what was known as the fatter crown guard. You can see they're flatter across the top. They're not pointed like the earlier cases. Moreover, in the late 60s, the original GMT, or second, it's not a second time zone, it's a half-speed 24-hour single-circuit hand, but it went from a smaller arrow to a broad arrow that you see here. So you've got those refinements as well as the early 70s introduction of the bezel in all black. But another one that you can't see, a refinement that's not evident just by looking at it, is the hacking seconds. Now, after about 1965, Rolex went to the higher beat 1575 movement, 19,800 vibrations per hour, 4 hands, hours, minutes, and seconds, in that 24-hour hand for pilots. And in 1971, that movement gained hacking seconds. So you're looking at the potentially more accurate, still COSC rated, later movement with the higher beat rate as well as the hacking feature to permit synchronization of that COSC chronometer to a reliable reference timer, to your co-pilot's watch, for instance. And that was an innovation that added mechanical value to the watch. Now, everything else about it continues in the Rolex tradition. Free-sprung escapement, Breguet overcoil hairspring, heat glued. It has a date, of course, not a quick set, but it does have the hacking feature. Still very tough. It's an outstanding piece of mechanical engineering as well as a gorgeous aesthetic effort and one of the best looking of the 1675 series. Now, other things that deserve to be called out are just the condition of the elements in general. There's a fair amount of the original factory beveling evident on the lugs, and this was done by hand. You can see it on the crown guards, and you can see it on the lugs themselves. If you check out this watch on our website, Watch You Want, you'll see that this watch certainly isn't among the unfortunate Rolex vintage references that's been absolutely polished to death. And as much as you can still see some of that original hand beveling and the contrasting finish, brushed on the top, polished on the sides, all of the gold still intact with phenomenal definition around the edges of the bezel, this watch is a true survivor. The dial looks great. Every element from the applied nipples to the printing to that Rolex coronet and the hands themselves is phenomenal. And then you've got the history of the GMT-Master itself. Originally developed in the mid-1950s, coming into service in late 54, early 1955, developed by Rolex in conjunction with Pan Am. The idea was that you would have a watch with that fourth hand operating in 24-hour circuits so that all pilots worldwide could have their watches synchronized to the same Greenwich Mean Time, GMT, which is why it's important to note that any GMT-Master before the 16760, the GMT-Master, not the Master 2, it is a single-time watch with a 12-hour local time hand, and then you've got that GMT hand moving in 24-hour circuits. That's an important distinction to make if you're not familiar with vintage Rolex or the original GMT-Master. But that brings into play one of the innovations that Rolex introduced with the model in the 50s, which is the bidirectional rotating pilot's bezel. Now, by rotating to offset GMT plus or minus, you can take that 24-hour GMT hand, which is always set to Greenwich Mean Time, and when you offset as per the local time, GMT value of your destination airport or any time zone of interest, you can then read that local time off the GMT hand after you offset the bezel forward or backwards to account for GMT plus minus. And that was the original innovation that set this watch apart from everything else on the market in the mid-1950s and really gave birth to a legend. But by the late 1970s, this 16753 two-tone had moved the original high-flying Rolex utility watch into the realm of high style, and I'm happy to say that now in the 21st century, this Rolex GMT-Master 16753 remains an outstanding looker in outstanding condition and a true time capsule from the heyday of Van Halen. I like to bring things full circle. This is the Rolex Oyster Perpetual GMT-Master reference 1675/3 stainless steel and yellow gold, available from Watch You Want.